All right, you guys can see my screen. Welcome to the Wheelhouse Data Deep Dive Town Hall for Destin and Santa Rosa Beach. We're going to look at some data across the Panhandle. I don't know if you guys have been to one of these before, but it's kind of like our revenue management roundtables we do, but we invite just kind of local people to come in and have a conversation about what's going on in the market, what kind of strategies are being employed. I'll give some advice myself, and we'll look at a bunch of data together. So it should be pretty fun. If you don't know me, my name is John deRoulet. I'm the head of revenue management education here at Wheelhouse. Been with Wheelhouse about 4 years, really focused on training and kind of consulting on revenue management with our clients. Um, Before that, I was a revenue manager for about 10 years at an organization called Stay Alfred, where I led a team of 10 revenue managers over a portfolio of about 3,000 units in 33 US cities. So, been in the game a long time doing revenue management. Uh, I'm going to do a little product thing briefly, and then we'll move off of that. But if you don't know Wheelhouse, Wheelhouse is a revenue management platform. We do offer dynamic pricing as part of our revenue management, but we also have a bunch of great tools to kind of like allow you to influence and take control over your revenue management strategy. We also, this is kind of a new thing, we have a huge performance analytics suite of business intelligence tools, and we are offering those for free to everyone. All you have to do is really go into Wheelhouse, sign up, and link your account, and you can access all of the business intelligence that I'm going to show you today. You can access a ton more that really makes it easy for you to see your pacing quickly. Um, and be able to see that across your portfolio or any group of listings. So if you're looking for some additional business intelligence, go ahead and sign up. We also offer free training on it. So if you'd like to set up some time, we'd love to talk to you about that. Okay, enough about the product. So let's jump in here. Few things that I kind of like to start with. I usually do a little poking around just to find kind of third-party data. I think it's a good thing. We're going to look at the Wheelhouse data and the performance data specifically, but I know that when you're talking to owners or if you're a revenue manager and you're talking to your executive team, sometimes it helps to have data from multiple sources to kind of support what you're doing because people don't always want to just share it from you, right? So there's a few things I pulled up here. The first, and this one is kind of interesting. I didn't log into it, but I did notice on the City of Destin website that you can actually access a major database. I don't know that they are supposed to do this, but they just give you the passcode to access this academic database. So if you're ever looking for like a lot of data, I didn't go into here. These academic databases are usually pretty expensive, and the City of Destin gives you their password, which is pretty cool. I didn't go in and try to find the data here, but that is if you're doing like kind of like that's going to be good for like really big demographic trend report kind of stuff if you ever need to access that information. Um, Especially economic information, you can usually access those here. We'll move off of that one though, because I didn't go into it. This one was pretty interesting to me. This was on the Okaloosa County site, and they did some research on the 2025 uh, kind of trends that they were expecting. So in a way, there's a few interesting things here that I wanted to point out, but this is starting to get a little bit old, right? Because we're halfway through 2025. Um, this one was not too interesting. This is some sentiment stuff, which I think they thought was kind of interesting, but there is something here that where was it? Let's see. This stuck out to me as being pretty interesting, particularly the growth that the hotel inventory continues to grow. Now, for your home situation, that's probably not going to be a huge uh, competitor. I mean, this is interesting because I think like just Destin's in Okaloosa County, is that correct? And then it goes into Walton County. So you're kind of on the edge, and the condo inventory probably isn't is important, but they have some growth here in the hotel inventory. They do show you a little bit of kind of how those are performing differently. The hotels tend to operate at a little higher occupancy, which is interesting to me, but are obviously operating at a much lower ADR in general. This is kind of interesting to me. This is probably because I imagine the snowbirds are actually coming into the market, and they're doing so at a much lower actualizing rate than what happens in the hotels. But even in those time periods, the hotels are maintaining kind of a much higher occupancy level. So I'm wondering if there maybe is some opportunities there, or this could just be a factor of the fact that the county has got a couple of markets that we're not really talking about right now. Um, the main thing that I did see here that I thought was pretty interesting, mainly
I
for you
think,
guys.
John, I
Yeah,
think it's important to note that Okaloosa um, gets a lot more government military than what Walton would get.
that makes sense.
So, and that is pretty much a consistent year round. So where you see that January, February higher in hotels than in the condo market, I'm sure it's military.
It is interesting because it's probably not close enough to like Destin, maybe because they're going to like the military base, right?
Yeah, I mean the military bases are in Okaloosa.
Yeah, because what's interesting to me is I wonder if you might be able to get some of those contracts in the winter, just because it's not too far away, but the per diem is actually seems to be higher. Like, government per diems are set, but they may be higher than what's actually going on in those like some of the snowbirds. And I guess it just is a matter of distance. And that's where like they may have, it makes sense that hotel inventory would grow around places where they have like that kind of contracted business. But it is curious to me. That government stuff is hard. We used to do it at my old organization. Hard to get contracts. Once you get them in place, they're okay, but kind of an interesting thing. The other thing here that I wanted to point out, and I'll just move on from this one because I don't think it's super interesting, but they do talk about what the county is spending money on doing from an advertising perspective. And I thought that was pretty interesting. In 2025, these were the primary feeder markets that they were spending money in terms of budget. Uh, and kind of making it's real. I think it's pretty interesting to me because that might align, like, you look using that in your own marketing to kind of align what you're doing could be helpful because this is where your CVB is spending the majority, I think 80 to 85% of their budget. And these cities don't necessarily match up with like what I hear people say they consider some of their most important markets. That might be a little different for summer. Um, Recently, I think we did one for spring and people were talking about the different spring break markets, but Georgia isn't on here. Well, I guess I'm wrong. Atlanta is on here. But this one I thought was pretty interesting. They also have some pretty interesting information just about how much they're driving to the Destin um, kind of visitors bureau page. Uh, that one's the most interesting thing here for me is that making sure they have some places where you're really like kind of, they have a vacations home piece, and they've doubled the amount of views year over year onto this page. So kind of making sure you're linked up with the CVB might be pretty interesting. They've been really pushing this kind of influencer and scout program. Uh, Being involved in those might be an opportunity for marketing, particularly if the markets themselves are under pressure. So I thought that was probably the most interesting thing here is them highlighting what they're doing in terms of their marketing spend for the Destin market at the page level, right? And that alone, I think, could be present some opportunities that are maybe some easy advertising opportunities or ways to kind of get your inventory forward. Okay, we'll send you these after. I'm not going to share that one. I didn't think it was that interesting. This is the last one. This is in the Visit Florida, so the Florida Research Department. If you're a member, you can actually access quite a lot of data. I'm not a member, so I can't. But the main thing here, I think, that I just wanted to take a look at is they are freely giving us the 2024 feeder markets across Florida. There is a way to get into county level, but I couldn't figure it out this morning. I figured it out before, but the main one here is this is still going to be a fairly small percentage of the overall book, like people who are coming to Florida. Canada being the biggest, Brazil being the second, and the United
Can-
Kingdom being the third.
Canada was the biggest.
Was the biggest, yeah, because this is the 2024 data. Um, Speaking of that, have you guys how has your next year snowbird bookings looking? Are you seeing that on the books?
Yeah, for us that we pretty much we get the same ones, the repeat ones year after year. We typically don't get Canadian, so we haven't been affected by that.
Awesome. I have heard from quite a few people that that's a lot weaker if they are getting Canadians. I think the Canadian business gets a little filtered down in the summer, so it's not as big of a concern. But I think for that Q1, Q2 is a concern, and I've talked to some people who've seen it quite a bit next year. Okay, let's hop into some data. Let's hop into Destin first. So I'm going to look at this in kind of two market areas, and then if time permitting, we can dive into like a specific beach or a specific area if we want to of these. I'm going to stick to these high level trends first because it's an easy way to talk. Destin is going to include Miramar right now. And then I've got Santa Rosa separate, mainly because this part of the system is using kind of zip codes to organize what we're doing. Um, yeah. Okay. So first thing I'm going to do here is we're going to hop over to the trends section and just kind of look at the occupancy trends going on in the market. Occupancy trends, I think, are a really great way to kind of just get a general idea of what's going on in the market if you're using us to support what's happening or using key data. I also think occupancy is one of the easiest ways to communicate to owners. Obviously, especially if you're going to send like general kind of like a snapshot of what's going on in the market. I think most owners, whatever their sophistication level, can understand an occupancy trend. Um, Obviously, we know that ADR is also involved, but that starts to make things very complicated because once you add the other, now you have three, you have RevPAR. So occupancy trends are a good way to just see the general things in the market. This market report that I am on, just so you guys know, uh, you can access if you're logged into Wheelhouse by just hitting this markets tab. All of these are free, so you can access all of the Wheelhouse market reports around the world without being a paying Wheelhouse customer. So you don't have to be doing pricing. You don't have to be using RBI tools. You can access this high level stuff at any time. Um, and it's a pretty useful tool. And I think for you guys, probably one of the most valuable pieces because the Panhandle has so many close markets is also kind of monitoring what's going on in other markets. Often when we do these data deep dive calls, we only really do one Wheelhouse market at a time. As we've been doing the Panhandle ones, we've kind of been doing two at a time just so you can kind of see some of the differences. And what you will see when we look at Destin and Santa Rosa is there actually is quite a bit different occupancy trend, despite the fact that these are areas that are pretty close to each other. Um, okay, so first kind of thing we're going to point out here when we're looking at this is we have year over year, month over month. So we're kind of looking at the whole year. And I am looking at everything in the market. So we haven't filtered down by any criteria. It's just kind of everything in general to give us a general idea of what's going on. First thing to point out, I think, which you guys all know, spring from February, March, a little rough. Now, some of that was made up in April, but would drop back down in May. One of the things from a sentiment perspective, from talking to people across the Panhandle that I've noticed is March seemed to catch people a lot by surprise. Just even with the understanding that Florida was moving, the occupancy pressure in March really did seem to catch people by surprise. Talked to a lot of people who seem to be panicking about that. Um, as we've gone through the year, that has seemed to settle down a little. Maybe that's acceptance. Maybe that's the fact that, April did make up for some of that March, so it kind of evened out. But people don't seem quite as panicked as they did when we were talking kind of in mid-end of March about market conditions. In terms of March, I think part of the problem is like one, Easter moved. I think consistently across the Panhandle, people have a higher expectation for spring than really what the consumer has been willing to do. And it's kind of the fact that it hasn't been as stable the last few years, but people still price it very high, I think puts people in a position to be kind of panicking a little bit more, particularly because it's Q1. So it's the first time that like there's a challenge to whatever optimism is built into the budgets. But I do think overall that kind of sentiment between from March to today in terms of like how the year is going to be has settled down a little bit, and people are expecting things to be a little bit more stable. That's not just the property managers and revenue managers I'm talking to. If you watched the revenue management roundtable where we brought on a lot of revenue managers from big orgs to speak, you would have heard that. But it also is the data companies as well. I spoke on a panel at the executive conference recently with Key Data and RDNA, and mostly it was still around like, hey, this year's probably going to look a little bit similar to last year, still, despite some of the kind of frothing that happened earlier in the year. In terms of like, would you guys agree with that? How do you feel things are kind of going this year right now?
I would say settling someone, but certainly I wouldn't say that I'm not concerned at all. I do think that March was a red flag because we just haven't seen overall market occupancy numbers like that. I mean, and I'm speaking more to the Walton County area. I mean, Walton County year to date, bed tax collections are down 9 point something percent. So let's just say 10%, which is a dramatic drop.
That is a pretty dramatic drop in receipts. Um, and that would include that's so when they're look that you said just bed tax, right?
Yeah, yeah, and Walton County, which would include Miramar, and then Santa Rosa.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. It's a pretty big drop. And I think that's a good way to put it, is I think the panicking sentiment from like the property managers has toned down, but they're among the biggest revenue managers, like the biggest orgs with the revenue managers over large orgs. They're not panicking, but they're also acting much more conservatively. There was a graph that I showed, which maybe I can show here if I can find it in a couple seconds. Um, where you can really see that among Wheelhouse users, of which we have a lot of really enterprise revenue managers in our program. So like an example would be like we do 360 Blue, we do Best Beach, some of the large ones. They have been able to they're being conservative much further out than you would expect, or that you see in like other markets around the country. So let me see if I can pull this up. Can you guys see this
Yes.
PowerPoint? So across the panhandle, this is like this line is showing how people in Wheelhouse, so just Wheelhouse users, are adjusting the strategies that they implemented like towards the beginning of the year. So we can obviously see that they made some major adjustments in the spring. But you can also see that they're starting to push up a little bit in the summer, except for Santa Rosa, which is very interesting. The Santa Rosa properties were coming back down. That'll relate to something I'll show you a little later. You're starting to see them bring that back up a little. These are mostly large revenue managers, so they start a little lower. They start more conservative in general. And so they were pushing this up a little in the summer, but they've already started to look all the way out into the fall and start making adjustments because that zero line is here. If this zero is like they're not doing anything to their rates. And these are people who are pretty active in revenue management. So they're making a lot of changes to their strategy throughout the year. But I think this kind of how far out this looks is really key, right? They're looking all the way out into September, already out into October, and making adjustments to their strategy to really drive occupancy early in a a more conservative way. And I think that describes through action what you were saying, Scott, is that like not necessarily panicking, but preparing. A counterpoint to that is these are some of the other Southeast markets. Um, and the Southeast markets, you just don't see people making those adjustments outside of like Branson. So kind of an interesting little tidbit there. Uh, take that one
Yeah.
with salt. Um, okay. So where did my pen go? It's over here. Let me put this back on my screen. Okay. So the real question here is how is summer doing? So we're at 63%, we're at 41%. for July. In terms of pacing, how are you guys? How is your pacing going for summer? And I know we're late in June already, but have you guys been pacing ahead? Have you been pacing behind? What's the story been there?
A little bit ahead.
A little bit ahead? And has that been the case kind of the whole time? Like since the beginning of the year, or did you like have you gone up and down through different parts of the year?
Up and down.
Okay. Anyone else want to share? No. Appreciate you, Sarah and Scott. The I've heard a few things from people across the Panhandle. If you were at DARM last year, which was in Destin, which was great, I was there, first time there. It's really nice. Um, the pacing before 2025 started was up, right? And very interesting thing about that presentation from Key Data early on was I heard very different perspectives from that, like takeaways. I heard some people being like, "Oh, occupancy is up. It's going to be a great year. Let's jack up the rates." Obviously, in hindsight, that was very risky. The other thing I heard, which is the position I was in, was even though occupancy was up, ADR was much more conservative. So people were driving early occupancy by being conservative in the rate position. Um, and I think that story has been kind of borne out. This rate positions have been or continue to be high, but there are consumers that are booking, even though the booking window seems to be changing and shifting in, there are consumers that are looking and booking in advance. Um, Around March, obviously, people were pretty panicked. I think things started to fall behind. Uh, in very early in January, they started to fall slightly behind for the summer, January, February. And then March, people were pretty panicking. And then obviously through April, May, we had a lot of financial news in the news cycle, which that kind of slowed down booking across the board. It seems we've really started to catch up much more in May. And when I look at this, I pulled up the pacing data for this one. And I'll show you kind of a basic way to do it if you're using this report. But last year at this time, we're at about 66% for June and about 42% for July. So pretty close to on pace, but the market is trailing slightly, in particular for June, right? So Destin is trailing a little bit in both months, but not much, especially for July. And July is probably going to be one of the most important pieces. But given the trend of like a number of these months really kind of falling behind, knowing that the gross receipts are down, I think it does belie needing to be in a more conservative position, which you obviously have. The way you apply that is going to depend on the size of your portfolio. If you have a really big portfolio, it's much easier to be conservative and build your rate up. If you have a small portfolio, you really got to stay in touch with what other people are doing because you are at a much bigger risk of underselling, right? But Destin does seem to be still trailing a little bit. If you want to do this calculation yourself, basically, we have a distribution chart here. Um, this is kind of like a basic way to use it on this chart if you're doing it and not just pulling up the data. But we have a lead time distribution chart. And so if you go to June, 20 days out, you can multiply the percentage of what was on the books by the occupancy to get the pace there. Okay. Now, a few things I like to look at when I'm looking at the market data is we're looking at the market as a whole. I do like to look at the kind of just high performance group to see if there's some difference in trends um, overall. Main differences here is the top performing listings have not as much attrition in March, still a little bit of a loss in May, higher occupancies overall. That's the other thing to keep in mind than what's going on at the market level. And pacing is still looking pretty good here, right? But it's probably about the same as where we were relative to the market as a whole. Because really the occupancies are so high across the summer that there's actually not a ton of difference between the highest performing listings from an occupancy perspective and the lowest performing listings. There is a difference, but it's not as dramatic as we see in some markets across the Southeast where like Market occupancy is around like 65, 70%, and then, it jumps up to like 85 plus. Um, the other thing I like to look at is just a little stuff around rates, right? So we know that's the other part. I think occupancy is a great way to tell a story, especially to owners. I mean, the story is that like, hey, tough year, receipts are down, trailing a little bit in pace. We're already kind of through June. It's running out of time for June. July is very much on the edge. Can we keep these? Do we have to hold these mins? Can we drop minimum length of stay? Stuff like that. Um, but for us, asking rates build a little bit of a story too when we're developing our revenue management strategy. So if you don't know what asking rates are in Wheelhouse, asking rates is the term we use to refer to the average posted prices. So this is the prices people are advertising, not necessarily the prices they're actualizing. So this is going to be prices from Airbnb. This is going to be prices from VRBO, and it's also going to be prices from direct with our customer base, which is pretty established in the Panhandle. Um, Looking at this, we can see, and we're just looking year over year, we do see that the market reacted a little bit to the attrition in March. Not a big drop. April had a push that probably, this is about equivalent. It's a little bit higher in April, actually. So with the shift in Easter, you can kind of see that. This is probably the most interesting mismatch, is we see that average prices in May were up, even though there was attrition in the occupancy. So a little bit of slowness for the market to respond to that attrition and occupancy. And we see increases in the summer still. So even though we're trailing a little in June, we haven't seen those equalize yet. Like the market is not quite cutting the rate down in response to the trailing pace. Now the pace isn't trailing a ton. And we know July isn't, but we're still seeing those kind of adjusted. Now across the market as a whole, we do see that people are keeping premiums pretty far out. So really, in a way, 60 days is the window that people are paying attention at a market level. You can see that outside of 60 days, the prices really don't become optimized. Now, that is a counterpoint to what I showed you among those kind of professional revenue managers who are using the platform in Wheelhouse. Those users in Wheelhouse are making adjustments that far out. And if you listen to any of the last revenue management roundtables, fall pacing does seem to be pretty good if you're priced correctly. And I think this actually presents a really interesting opportunity for people, especially people who are losing ground here. You're probably not going to be able to drive additional occupancy to the market here, but what you can do is take market share, and you have to be able to like be priced effectively for the consumers that are looking now to take that market share and basically drive additional revenue by driving occupancy. If you have a smaller portfolio, the easiest way to do that is really just to find the listings that didn't make a lot of bookings in this time period. And really, it's not this whole time period. It's probably like mainly October and maybe a little bit of September, a little bit of October, and maybe a little bit of August, depending on how far August goes out. Like summer stretches into August this year. But whatever month you choose, there is some occupancy available here. And there are some people booking now. And if you take those properties that didn't really book a lot last year, you can really do whatever you want there because any amount of occupancy is going to be additional revenue. That's the easiest way to start making tests about the booking window and see if you can take some of the market share from this time period. There's not going to be a ton, right? It's not a high season. We're still probably not in the main booking window, but there are people booking this far out. And pricing that effectively is going to give you a good opportunity to kind of drive additional occupancy that can maybe make up for any shortfalls you had here or any shortfalls that are starting to show up here. Um, what do you guys, any thoughts on that? How do you guys think of that? Or Scott, if you want to speak more.
No, I think everything you're saying is very fair. The comment that sticks out is, stealing share as opposed to gaining share. And that's the problem in our market is, creating new demand because we have such an increase in inventory.
Yeah, that is going to be really hard. And I'll switch to Santa Rosa here in a second. And I think this is actually something that's really important to pay attention to in the Panhandle is other market areas might be stealing share, especially during, I think when I recall looking at like Panama City and stuff, a lot of people return to these beaches, but Panama City's CVB had a great um like kind of destination analysis where they asked like the people who come what their favorite beaches are and do they come back to this like Panama City. And they listed all these other beaches. And what was really interesting to me is there was a huge difference. In summer, like a lot of the people who come for summer were like, it was like over 70% were like Panama City Beach is my favorite beach. I go to the other beaches, but this is my favorite one. I prefer to come back here. In the spring, it was like they were like way down the list and it was a totally different set of different beaches. So it's like not even consistent. And I think that now more than ever, with the way inventory is and the way people are sensitive to price, these market areas are competing against other beaches much more than they used to, especially if you're not in like the elite luxury brand. I think elite luxury is operating very different. That's very strong still across the country. But anyone who's kind of under that elite luxury, I think that people's budgets are going to drive it, which means they're going to look around to the different beaches. And if the different beaches are pacing differently, they're going to have different pricing behaviors. And that's going to cause consumers to bounce around at different times in the booking window. It's my hunch. I don't know how you prove that. It's hard, right? But I think more than ever, you guys do have to not just look at your own market area, but also look at the surrounding market areas that have similar category of inventory. So similar kind of like economic target market. Um, just to see, because I think the concern is like if one of the nearby markets is pacing really poorly, their price collapse may impact your pace, is I guess what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Um, okay. So last piece here before we switch over to Santa Rosa Beach, let's go look at the highest performing group just to see if there's a little difference. There is here, and this is the difference that I see pretty commonly across Southeast markets. Not all of them, but generally speaking, the highest performing listings are operating a little bit more conservative in price. So when we were looking at all of the listings, you can see that there's, this is still pretty conservative, but generally pushing price across most of the year and then not looking out past August but not making that super competitive. When we go to the highest performing listings, you see that prices are much more in line year over year in general, at least here. May pushed price a little bit, kind of didn't come back, didn't bite back. So maybe the market got a little, it's, a little up and down, a little bipolar, right? Panic in March. April comes through with some decent revenue, push the rate in May, don't quite hit the occupancy again. Now acting a little more conservative. So unlike the market as a whole, where we're pushing prices a little in summer, the top performing listings are actually getting a little conservative. In fact, they've fallen a little in July. And then you can see that trend I was talking about here. Prices established competitively for August and September already, right? So that's a trend that you're seeing in the top performing listings. They are just looking out further. Now they're still making mistakes, right? This May, I think, is a miss, right? The occupancy was a little lower here in May. Still pushed the rate, but that has already been corrected across this cohort of listings to some degree. And I think, yes.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, keep in mind with May, if you're used to like the Saturday arrival departure, that Memorial Day would have checked out in May this year versus June last year. So that would have impacted the ADR for May.
That makes sense. Yeah. So it kept rates high, but the occupancy was still down. So I think that there's just a little bit of a miss there in terms of that mismatch. But you are right. It could just be that like, well, we can look at this. Let's take a look at the overall year over year Memorial Day occupancy. Okay, interesting. Good point. So it does make sense that ADR would be higher here. And that actually performed. Memorial Day performed, right? It's actually in this high performing group, it's a little bit higher than last year. And across the market, the market as a whole, it performed well. It's really the rest of May that underperformed consistently. Now, we can look at how people were pricing that. Let's see. I don't have asking rates on this one, so we'll use nightly rate. Nightly rate's going to be ADR. And this one's a little bit messier to look at, so we'll take a look. So we do see that ADRs were generally higher across that first half of May. than what they were last year. And this should be pretty apples to apples, considering that the way that OTAs are just like this is actualized rate, so it's a little different than other stuff. We have a lot of direct data here, but you are right. Memorial Day was solid. The rest of the month just didn't capture the occupancy that it did last year, and they kept the rate position a little high. Interesting thing about Saturday to Saturday. Are a lot of you guys still holding Saturday to Saturdays?
I hope everybody has learned at this point that that's a bad idea. I think it was a learning year for a lot of people, and that's probably why spring break suffered so much, because they were still trying to hold that 7 night, and there's still people trying to hold 7 night for the summer. They probably held it too long, which is why a lot of people may be pacing behind for the summer. And then I think again, you just have to manage further out too, and some people have already switched their spring break for 2026 to 7 nights, and I'm like, why are you doing that? It's not going to happen for you. So yeah, I think some people, yeah, it's just a learning year, I think, for not only property management companies, but also the homeowners too.
Yeah.
100% agree, as usual with Susan.
That's because you're awesome, Scott.
I would say the Panhandle, interestingly, is leading the charge on learning this. You guys in this market are reacting much better to this over the last 2 years than say the Southeast, where like if you go into the Carolinas, it's like 90% Saturday to Saturday, and they're really struggling to adopt systems to adjust to that in the short term. Particularly the way their contracts are set up. And I do think that trend is going to continue. I'm a millennial. I have never booked a 7 night stay in my life for anything.
But it's not even just millennial now. I mean, like if you think of and I'm talking mainly Sandestin West, that leisure traveler, traditionally like a family of 4 to 5, they are affected by grocery prices. Not that we all aren't, but they are. So if they're coming, they're not coming for as long as they used to. They just can't afford it. And so that traveler in the Carolinas is affected by grocery prices too, and those people, that they're still holding to the 7. That's crazy.
Yep. And I think, and Edson's a youngest traveler, but my calculus is always if I'm going to take 1 week off of work, I need 1 day to get there, and I need 1 day off before I go back to work. So I book a lot of 6 night stays, and I book a lot of 5 night stays, and I book a lot of 10 night stays. But and this is interesting. So this is March. This is data that you might be able to share with your owners too, just at a high level to give them an idea. This is March 2024. Even last year in March, the 5 and 6 night is higher than the 6-7. The 6-7 is actually a pretty low proportion. And the 7 to 8 exactly is pretty low. If we go to March 2025, oh, wrong button. We see a pretty similar trend, right? This is in fact growing. So this just under the week is still really strong, actually. So the funny thing is that like by taking off the 7, the Saturday to Saturday, it's not like you're going to just guarantee that you get these 3-4 nights. There's a really strong contingent of this, and actually adding up this to this is more than just the exactly 7 nights. So this is the kind of like 8 to 13. And I think that's pretty interesting kind of trend, is just making sure you have the tools to control that length of stay. When I talk to people, I guess this is a question, how far out do you guys drop from a 7 night if you're holding it?
I've dropped 7 nights already for next year.
That makes sense. Okay, so you're doing it right off the bat. What were you saying, Susan?
I said that's because Scott is wise.
Yeah, I talked to a number of people when in talking about Wheelhouse. A lot of people really get stuck only looking 30, maybe 60 days out. And I think the number one revenue management advice I give to people is you need to look 2 seasons out. And actually, the amount of time you spend on the next, like the short-term window that shouldn't take as long as people spend it, because usually the answer is you're going to cut the rate to drive occupancy. People don't really functionally do too much different, and but they spend all their time there. And the most valuable time that you can spend is, June is, there's 2 weeks left in June. If you're focusing on June, there's not much you can do other than cut the rate to try to drive occupancy, and it's just deciding how much you're willing to cut. But July, where the market is kind of just slightly under, that's changing week to week. That's where you really want to look. And if you spend just a little time out here, you might be able to drive extra occupancy. So my advice is always establish what your short-term window is. Just make that a regular process and simplify it for your revenue management so you're not spending all your time there. Then focus on your kind of next big booking window, and then give a little attention to the season following. Okay, let's take a look at Santa Rosa Beach here, since we are eating up a bunch of time. Main thing here, and I don't need to walk you through what all these buttons do. Main thing here is, let's look at the occupancy, is Santa Rosa Beach has a little bit different trend going on. And if you recall from the rate thing I showed you, they also were acting a little different there too, which was interesting to me. One, not as much attrition in this market, pretty much across the board, right? Didn't lose ground in March, gained quite a bit of ground in April, gained a little bit of ground in May. So that's already consistently different than Destin. And pacing in June and July, looking really, really high. I mean, they're 10% away from being where they were last year in June. And they're still about, a little more than halfway in July. In terms of the pacing for this, last year at this time, Santa Rosa Beach was at 60% occupancy. So they're actually pacing ahead. They're pacing like over 7% ahead. And last year for July, they were at 46%. So a little bit lower in July. So interesting. July's are pretty similar. They're within 1%, so pretty close. But they're actually pacing ahead in June. Pretty fascinating. If you recall what I was showing you on this chart, where did it go? This is the users of Wheelhouse. Santa Rosa Beach is here. They're the ones that are making adjustments, and you can see already early they were making adjustments in June. And I did this is about a month old now. So they were making some pretty early adjustments here. They're also already starting to make some adjustments in the fall. So making some moves from a revenue management perspective, and you can kind of see that in the pace. The pace at the market level is higher. When we look at the highest performing groups, you see a similar trend. Pretty much not under, just if you talk to people in this area, or if your owners have friends in this area, they may have a very different perspective of what's going on in the market currently, in just this kind of Santa Rosa Beach area. Now, you also do see a little bit different rate trends as well across the board. Pretty much across the board, rate positions are much more conservative. So even at the whole market level, there's almost no month that the market is pushing rates, and that includes for the summer. Now, you do still see that trend, which is market level. People kind of stop paying attention after 60 days, right? August and beyond, still pretty high. When you look at the highest performing listings, still seeing fairly conservative rate positions, except for April, where we see them able to push some rate and actually achieve that. This, you do see them start to look out. So August is already pretty conservative to last year. Little bit of a shift in September, October, but not quite as much difference as the high performers in Destin. My guess would be that probably has to do with like a little difference in inventory, and booking window in general. But overall, there's a little bit more conservative pricing behavior at a market level compared to last year here than in Destin. There tends to be better pacing. Now, I wouldn't take that and say, they're taking your market share. They might be, there's a lot more nuance to that. You probably need to look at a little more specific groups of listings. But that trend, I think, is pretty interesting. Is just the small takeaway here is that Santa Rosa Beach is being more conservative, and it's seeing a little higher drive in terms of its pacing. It's in a different situation, and that means they're going to operate their pricing different going forward than maybe the pressure that's being seen in Destin as a whole. What do you guys think about that? Does that match? How are you, if you have properties in Santa Rosa Beach, how are you guys pacing? And just so you know, our market for Santa Rosa Beach here is going to be this area. So these there's almost no listings up here, so you can kind of ignore them. It's like 10, 6. Most of them are here, but it doesn't include Miramar, and it does go down a little bit.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you're saying.
Interesting thing to note for you guys as well, if you do compete, we did the Panama City one. And I can actually have Edson send that to you guys if you're interested as well. They have also a different situation. They're actually pacing pretty well, and pretty stably for the summer. So, and next week we'll be doing one for, what did we choose? Are we doing Okaloosa and Navarre? Or in 2 weeks? We're doing Okaloosa and Navarre, and it's 2 weeks, right? And we'll take a look at those, but these markets are all operating a little differently. And I think that ebb and flow of like, oh, well, if this market's pacing behind, their price position starts to drop in the short term. Now, suddenly that affects everyone else's short-term window, because obviously if you're on Airbnb and you're using a map like this, you're going to get really good deals over here instead of where you were here. So this pacing can change a lot. And really making sure you're following this week to week for the summer is really important. And then I think just giving a little bit of time, maybe even 30 minutes, to just glance at what you're doing in your overall rate position for the fall can really just help drive a little extra revenue, kind of like buttress any losses that might occur in certain properties. That's kind of the advice from a strategy level. If you don't have access to pacing in your own portfolio, I'll show you briefly, and I'm not going to do too much because this isn't a product demo, but Wheelhouse's free business intelligence is really built around giving you visibility into your pacing. So this is a chart. I have it on occupancy, and it's showing the occupancy on the books to stay in a given week. So this is like the week of July 13th to the 19th. It's showing me how much occupancy I have staying over that week. And it's also highlighting the sales. So I can see in the last week, I've sold 2% of the 41% occupancy I have. This updates every day. You can see it for any group of listings. So you have full filtering capabilities. I could look at just my 2 bedrooms. I could organize specific market areas and say, hey, this one's on Santa Rosa, this one's on Grayton Beach. And this is a great way just to keep in touch with what is going on in your own sales very quickly. It's kind of like, in a way, key data light, but I think we make the actual pacing and sales much easier to see, because key data, you're looking at the market and you look at where you are and where you were last year, but you don't always see the sales. And that's the important piece, because if you have a week here that's not selling, that's the week you need to make a go and make an adjustment on, right? Or if you have a week that's selling really quick, or maybe you made an experiment where you adjusted the fall and you're like, oh, well, this is selling a lot. You can make the decision. Do I want to hold that? Do I want to apply that discount to other properties, or do I want to bring the rate back up? This is pretty flexible. You can do this all the way at the daily level. So if you're doing short stays, you don't have to look at it at the week. You can actually look at it by day. So we can see that, there's a lot of difference here. This date, that needs some attention, not getting any sales. All of that September stuff, it's actually selling across just Labor Day. So I need to maybe take a look at that. In addition to that, you can see your same time last year data here too, and it does show you the sales for both weeks. So if you're looking at same time last year, you can easily just identify these differences. So you can see that this has moved. This week was not selling last year either, and really just kind of like help you find the needle in the haystack, because I know everyone's limited on how much time they can spend on revenue management. Not everyone's a professional revenue manager. And so you need to be able to, if you're only going to do this for an hour a week, you need to make sure that hour is pretty valuable, right? And so this is a great tool. We offer it for free for anyone. If you'd like some training on how to use this, along with some processes that you can implement if you're doing 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours of revenue management a week, we'd be happy to meet with you with one of the revenue managers on our team and just get you set up and kind of teach you how to use this. But I think for this market data, as you guys know, it's a week-to-week battle, and you need to be paying attention to this pace in your own portfolio and make the decision, overall, if hey, the market's maybe trailing a little bit, you're comparing that to your own pace. So am I up? Am I down? Am I even? And then you kind of have an idea where you're going to go week to week. And then again, I really suggest that you spend a little time just positioning this, because the market is just not optimized out here in both markets across the board. really. Sorry, I'm clicking on these stupid lines. And so whenever the market is not optimized to actually sell to the consumer, I think that there's just opportunity there to take market share.
I like it.
Awesome. Well, we can end a little early. I know everyone's busy because it is summer. But if you have any questions for me, happy to stay on and answer them. Otherwise, really appreciate your guys' time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one.